Okay. My name is Lilly McElroy, and I'm an artist living in Lawrence, Kansas, right now. And I would say for the last few years, my interest has primarily been in kind of making feminist interventions into the landscape. Sometimes they are comedic. Often, what I do has a lot to do, a tint of humor in it in order to kind of like lure the viewer in. I've done kind of past projects where I've like burst through like a paper version of a landscape in a similar way that like a football team would. I make photographs in which I go into like beautiful epic landscapes and then try to control the sun using kind of like very like perspective, like very basic perspective tricks. So there's this kind of element of trickery and deceit to a lot of what I do, but it really kind of like centered on this kind of like insertion of the female form into the landscape and what it means for me kind of as like a feminist artist to make work that does that, that kind of contends with the history of the representation of the female body in the natural world. So that's a lot of what I'm doing. One of the things that became really interesting for me with the sanding away years worth of sunsets is I'm a photographer by training. I went to school for that. I think a lot about photography, but I also love this kind of like the physicality of it that so often doesn't kind of come across in our kind of digital world. So I was interested in what would happen if I could physically begin to break down a photograph. So this like feeling of like me touching this thing is going to kind of break it down. I also did a lot when I was going to undergrad. I worked for the Center for Creative Photography was one of my student jobs, and I got to handle a lot of prints and like dealing with this preciousness of the prints. So I love this kind of like moment of like, I'm gonna get to like destroy it. So I wanted to make this piece that was about my female hands touching and breaking away the image. And the sun for me is this kind of symbol of power, but also this kind of like funny, somewhat dorky like nod to photography is like this like capturing and contending with light. And so I decided to like print out, I like duration, like I tend to make work that in one way or another has a durational component. So I decided to think about time and like this kind of like big chunk of time, which is a year. So a year's worth of something feels really like substantial. So I printed out 365 photographs of the same sunset and decided that I was going to kind of use my finger and kind of start altering it, the images by touch. When I first started thinking about this, I thought I was going to just like use my fingernail, but then I realized that was crazy. So I started using a little piece of sandpaper. And the 365 photographs are all stacked in like a stack of, so they're 8 by 10 and it's about 4 inches thick. And I'm just essentially just like systematically sanding away and kind of performing this gesture that is like simultaneously like very tender. So it's this kind of like very small touch. But it's, it's destructive. So it's kind of like line between like the tender and the destructive.
And one of the things that I really enjoy about your piece, Sanding Away the Sunsets, is you talk a little bit about, in your statement, kind of about this idea of the American West. And I love your kind of, this idea, like, I think you said twice, like, you want to insert yourself into this landscape. And I think the second time I loved the way you phrased it, just like this, I demand that it becomes aware of my presence. And I love that phrasing. And I love these ideas of looking at this romanticized idea of the American West, which is itself very masculine and doesn't leave a lot of room for a feminine identity or women's identity. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I feel like that history is so much about conquest. Like, I think a lot about manifest destiny and this like movement forward and this like notion that you have the right. And that just, it feels so like, again, aggressive and like historically male.
Right.
And and I think for me, there's this kind of like a certain power of like being like, yeah, but I belong here too.
Right.
Like I have the right to be here. I have the right to be seen here. And I have the right to kind of like have this kind of like moment with it in a way that isn't about me as like object or me as decoration. And I think that's something that I'm dealing with in the work kind of over and over again, is this kind of like this strange thing that happens when it's no longer a male body. When it's a female body that is being seen and a female body that is active in one way or another. There was a project I did years ago where I kind of drove across the country playing Bruce Springsteen's Dancing in the Dark to the American Landscape. And it's just a video of me kind of using that like wanderer above the sea of fog stance. So you just see my back, and then I have a boombox over my head. But it's again this moment of like this, where the female is kind of speaking to the land as opposed to just kind of like being this kind of like vessel within it. And one of the things that was really kind of like wonderfully surprising and strange about the sanding project was like how overtly feminine that shape became. Like I knew it was about like my female hands touching, but I didn't realize it just by the act, like naturally the action that I was performing was going to make this vulvic shape.
Right.
So
and that was like one of my questions. And there you can see it behind me.
Yeah.
Was whether that was intentional when you started, or if that's kind of how it went.
I mean, I knew I was going to be standing in a circle just because of the shape of the sun, but then the motion that I had to perform just kind of like elongated into this oval. So I realized it quickly, but it was definitely a happy, like, oh yeah, this is the female. It's not just my female hands, it's the female form.
Yeah.
Or, a version of the female form.
Right. And I think that's, I love that part about it, because I think when you look at it, you recognize that shape. And I love how you kind of talk about like, again, just very, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but very much like this, identity belongs within this context as well.
I mean, I think it's a combination of things. I think there is something aggressive about it, even though if it's not always overt. In the same way that I think there's something really violent about this, is like this destruction that is taking place, even though the touch that is like helping to generate it is very like strangely sensual and very small. Yeah. And I also love thinking about this like notion of time with something like this, and like the change that takes place over time through small action. Both like something that like, in this case, it feels like it still doesn't necessarily feel as monumental as I think it feels to me. But yeah, I think there's like kind of like monumental change that can take place through like systematic like practice.
Right.
I feel like this has a really interesting relationship to absurdity.
Right.
And this kind of like idea of like doing something, like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and like expecting different results, which isn't exactly what I'm doing, but like this repetition and like like how long it took to accomplish this small task feels absurd and ridiculous. And I like that.
I think that goes back to that kind of like humorous aspect of it, where it's just, and I think you could talk a little bit about the installation of this piece, because I think that also is, to me, I feel like it's a very dramatic installation, because you have those lights, you have the video, and it all kind of comes together in this large piece, which I think emphasizes that idea of absurdity in a way. I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that.
I mean, I agree. I feel like it's like creating the kind of like monumental, like out of the minimal,
right?
Somewhat. I mean, I think this piece is so much about process. And when I first started, I had it's on a copy stand, which is like a very traditional photographic thing. So you used to like take pictures of something from an overhead angle. So there's like lights that shine on it. There's a place so you can attach your camera. And I'm filming the entire process using like a little like handheld video camera. So every time I sit down to sand, I record it. And it felt really important for the installation of the piece to kind of acknowledge that that kind of like that duration, that kind of methodology. So the installation is kind of like pointing towards that. And I think it also helps me like point towards the like ridiculous amount of time that I spent on this. Like, I mean, it's over 267 hours of labor. That was just like what I could quantify without driving myself crazy. But I worked on this for over 2 years. And kind of like returning to it and moving it from place to place as I moved. So yeah, the installation is on a table or a pedestal, the copy stand with these kind of like beautiful, what I think are beautiful anyway, lights shining down on the stack. And then the video camera plays a live feed of the stack to a monitor that's on the ground. And then also in the show, there's the video. So like this uncut 267 plus hours of me performing this motion, slowly kind of delving in. And then those moments also where I'm cleaning, because there were moments where I had to like get the sand out. Right. So I had a little like, one of those like computer keyboard vacuums.
Yep.
So I used to like suck up. So there's moments where you see me vacuuming, all these kind of like little moments of like care that have to like of tending to that have to happen in order for me to kind of like make the piece are also included.
I remember when you brought it in, you had talked about the dust and like including this dust within the piece.
So in other installations, I've included the dust that I collected is again this kind of like strange, like it's a monument, but it's so like such a pathetic one. Like it's this like pile of dust that's like, you know, that much, in like this like little pyramid shape. But I like this kind of like the kind of sadness and ridiculousness of like all the labor that is used to make that piece can be like quantified in this little pile. I also like thinking of like death and this kind of like return to like in changing forms and all this kind of thing.
Yeah. And I like that idea too, where like, I mean, it is almost, it's still, you still have the whole of the piece and it's just been changed into this other, other part, which I think is kind of interesting.
That was another moment that I was really happy about. Like, again, it's like, getting to think about transformation. I mean, one of the things I like about the photograph, and I like what's happening on your head, is the halo that was like strangely generated around the hole. So it becomes like almost like Virgin Mary biblical.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole, like I think the aesthetics of like that piece, the way that it turned out, like, it's really beautiful.
Yeah, this like cavern.
Yeah.
And like what you see behind you is that photograph. Like when I finally finished sanding the entire thing, I took a photograph of it. So that's like that last, like all the like evidence of my hand, like a little sandpaper and like the weird, like, everything that happened is recorded on that top sheet.
Could you talk a little bit more maybe about, I think you talk in your statement about coming from the Southwest and kind of being raised around these different cliches that exist within this idea of landscape.
But I think I didn't figure this out until kind of surprisingly late in life, but I mean, I spent a lot of my childhood like wandering around these really like epic kind of grandiose landscapes. My dad's a falconer, so we would go hunting with him, and it's like so much of it is like just walking around the desert looking for quail while like you have a bird with you, which is very romantic. You know, as a kid, I thought it was boring as all get out, but so I think this like having this like relationship that is like spent so much in like slowly wandering around these spaces and kind of like soaking in this romance. I think like later on when I was in high school, I did a lot of cross country running, so long distance running in the middle of and they would just drop us off in the middle of the desert, you know, on a dirt road, because I'm from a very small town. On a dirt road in the middle of the desert, and then you would just run down the dirt road until you got to the like mile 5 or whatever that you were supposed to run down. So you'd be out there for extended periods of time, just running and contending with the landscape. So I think that seeps in. And I also think like dealing with the history of the West and kind of the mythology of it. A lot of my, or some of my early work deals very directly with my relationship to masculinity and the kind of like type of masculinity that you would associate with and actually find in the Southwest. I have an early video where I'm kind of like, I'm in a bar and I'm like physically like pushing my body against cowboys as like the band plays. And I think it's, the landscape for me is a very similar thing. It's this kind of like, this thing that has this like very like kind of strange and specific mythology that often is about conquest, but is also about beauty. And I think kind of like our like historical and kind of cultural relationship to the natural world is so much about conquest. Like even moments of exploration aren't necessarily about always about like learning and appreciating, but about like taking ownership. And that's like so like off like strange and problematic. And yeah, so I think that's some of the things that I'm kind of like thinking about as I'm making work that deals with the landscape. Yeah.
To kind of build on that a little bit, and something that I've been talking with the artists about, because the biennial is specific, you know, to the mountain plains region.
Yeah.
What we want to do is focus on contemporary art within this region. And it kind of sounds like, I mean, there's some very specific things about being within this region that have really influenced you in your work. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what it means to you to be an artist, a contemporary artist within this region?
I mean, a couple of things, like just like pragmatically, I think my quality of life has improved. It's nice here.
Yeah, that seems to be like a comment that I get from a lot of the artists when I ask them that, like, oh, well, I can have a house and a studio and like, and
no, I can afford to actually make work.
Yeah,
which is like a real thing. Like my time, like I lived in LA for a while, and again, I loved Los Angeles. I have nothing really negative to say about it, but like being in a car and like driving for hours to like get to work definitely like sucks up time.
Yeah.
So like I think like having the freedom and the space to make work has been really lovely. Also, I think the community that I've found here has been really amazing.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of like there's so much like of this like there's like really lovely established organizations that are doing good work. There's also and then coupled with that, there's a really like lovely DIY kind of like we're gonna do it because we need to and we want to. So this is like kind of like these like two kind of like ways of like, or like, I don't know, art admin things that like seem to be circling and working in tandem in really nice ways. That hand gesture makes sense, I think. No, so I think that's helped, but also like, I feel like dealing with like both for me, like the landscape feels simultaneously expansive and claustrophobic.
Right.
I kind of love that weirdness of like, I feel like it's my encounter with the sublime, or this kind of like feeling that I kind of perhaps inaccurately kind of attached to like the notions of like the Kantian sublime. So like encountering the space that you can't contend with feels really real or really true to like standing in a field and looking at this like horizon where there's like nothing but field.
Yeah, space.
This is like a weird comparison, but I used to scuba dive when I was younger. And I remember this like moment of like having like to pause midway to kind of like get your like to decompress, like get your body to adjust in this
Oh
moment
yeah,
where you, like,
or you get the bend.
yeah. So you're in the you're just kind of floating midway between the bottom where you've been and the top where you're going, and just looking out around you, and it's all just kind of like nothing, and it's terrifying, but it's
Yeah.
that moment. So yeah, I feel like that there's this kind of like sense of, I did a really lovely residency, God, almost 2 years ago now, at the Prairie Side Cottage, kind of by the Flint Hills, and it was just like amazing to be able to like go and walk just around like the area, and kind of like contend with like these rolling hills that like seem to go on forever.
Yeah, it's such a, I mean, I think it's such a beautiful
Mm-hmm.
landscape. It's such a beautiful part of the country. And I feel like this idea of the prairie gets a bad rap. Like, there's so much diversity in prairie plants and everything. And like when you're in it, you start to realize all of that different stuff about it. So I liked your comments about like being kind of in the middle, like when you're coming up from scuba diving and having to sit and wait, because maybe that's kind of where we all are right now.
Oh God, let's feel like where we are.
And that's another question I've been asking the artists is there anything particular that you're doing now that we're all kind of in this holding pattern due to the virus?
Well, I mean, I feel like I'm teaching, obviously, and one of the things that I've been doing is actually making work with my students, which has been like not something I would normally do. But I signed this project that makes them do self-portraits. So self-portraits just kind of like a way to like make work quickly, make work with the self, because like we're all, you know, hopefully, I guess, social distancing as much as possible. So this kind of like feeling of like, how do you make work when you have to like, when it's you and you're like alone. So self-portraiture is actually, I've been making a lot of self-portraits, and it's been really kind of fun and interesting for me because I'm trying to make them in a way that is like really loose and all about just kind of like, I'm going to use my phone. I bought a selfie stick, and I'm making these like very quick self-portraits that are like never meant to, that they go on Instagram. And maybe they become physical later, but right now they're just kind of like this thing to like put out into the world that gets seen by people. And some of them are funny, I hope. I think they're funny. And some of them I think are beautiful and dark. So it's like that kind of like method of like working and playing. In this moment when I don't feel like I necessarily should be going outside.
Right.
Yeah.
I like those ideas of like working and playing. And I feel like that's another, I think, thread that artists have been talking about, this opportunity to explore in ways that they might not have had the opportunity to do if we were just working.
Yeah. And I think that's actually like really useful for an artist. At least it's useful for me, like having these situations that require me to respond. I also kind of feel like the landscape is like the drama element for a lot of my work. And now like all that drama feels like it's the internal drama of like being home and like, how do you deal with like the personal space and the home space?
Right.
I think that's something I've been thinking about. Like, I think my couch has become this like weird performance space for me as I make photographs where I'm sitting on it.